Welcome to the second event at the new Foreign Correspondents Club headquarters in Tokyo. My name is Andrew Horvath. I'm a former president of this club, and it's my great pleasure to introduce you to William Horsley, who many of you already know. William was here in the 1980s and early 90s as a BBC bureau chief. He went on to be also BBC bureau chief in Bonn and later Berlin, and then I think European correspondent, if I'm not mistaken. And then he left the BBC and co-founded the Center for what is the Freedom of the Media at the University of Sheffield, where he is now director of the international section. And he's also the author of several OSCE guidebooks on safety of journalists, including one which is forthcoming. And he spoke recently at a symposium in Waseda, which was sponsored by the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, which is also has generously funded his stay in Japan. He will speak about the open season on journalists and the rising dangers for journalists in the present time, and how this is linked, or perhaps not linked, to the business, to the collapse of the business model of the traditional media and the emergence of rather weak and though passionate digital journalists. Thank you. Take it away.
Very many thanks to the FCCJ, and especially to my long-standing friend and colleague Andrew Horvath for this invitation. Also to the Friedrich Ebert Foundation, who enabled me to come to Japan this time. It's an enormous pleasure to be back in the FCCJ, even though the place has moved. I feel like it's my second home. I first became a member here, hold your breath, 44 years ago. As I must have been in small trousers, I think, at that time. But the timing of this meeting, with the title it's been given, is extremely timely, because the vital role of journalists in informing the public, in holding down corruption, in exposing wrongdoing, and in informing the world about what happens in war zones and other dangerous places, has never been more important and has never been more fraught with risk. Today, Junpei Yasuda, who was held for 3 years in Syria in what he says was a hell, is, I believe, speaking to the press for the first time about now. About 60 other journalists are still missing, many of them in that same region. James Foley, of course, and Kenji Goto were among those who didn't escape with their lives. We're also fresh in our minds is the horrendous story of the killing on the 2nd of October of Jamal Khashoggi, the Saudi journalist killed in a state-sponsored act of murder in the Saudi embassy, in a consulate in Istanbul. 2 weeks, and the question is whether the high status of those who are, of course, the suspects of that murder will be protected from facing justice in the way that nearly all other killers of journalists around the world have been. Just today, the UN has published its latest figures, saying that since between 2006 and 2017, as many as 1,009 journalists around the world were killed in the course of their work. This year, until now, the number is at least 86, Jamal Khashoggi among the most recent. But today is also a day in Beirut, in Paris, in New York. People are now preparing to mark the International Day to end impunity for crimes against journalists. This was declared by the UN General Assembly in 2013. I'm really pleased that in Tokyo, here at this club, we're also going to be able to remember those journalists and call for justice for their killers. So I propose, as will happen in the other cities today, that we stand for a moment of silence in memory of the killed journalists. Thank you. I think it might be appropriate to start with reading just a few lines from the World Association of Newspapers declaration of today, International Day to End Impunity for Crimes Against Journalists. They say, the world marks the 2nd of November, the International Day to End Impunity for Crimes Against Journalists, at a time when the threats to journalist endeavours are more widespread than ever. Impunity has come to dominate the discourse around the safety of journalists. 9 out of 10 of the recorded murders of journalists remain unsolved, a shocking statistic that brings demands on states, on their institutions, and the global bodies working to assist them to provide urgent solutions to drive down those numbers. So actually today is not just a day about information, it's a day about preparing for action and for conscience, acting on conscience. We need to think as a journalistic community, as civil societies, and indeed as governments, of new ways to end this scourge of impunity which is threatening the international-based, rules-based order of the world. And that is now the position of the UN and particularly UNESCO, the agency which has a mandate to protect journalists and their work. Many journalists are not aware that the UN every year now passes a resolution specifically taking further the question of government's obligations to protect journalists and their safety and their work in numerous ways. The most recent one in the Human Rights Council is the most complete, and I recommend it to your attention. It was at the end of September. Self-censorship has been more and more monitored and reported on around the world. Even in Europe, it is now absolutely common and practically everywhere. This is well documented. The UN in 2012 started a very rare thing, an interagency, multi-stakeholder action plan on the safety of journalists and the issue of impunity, recognizing the threat to democracy, democratic functions around the world. My centre at Sheffield, the Centre for Freedom of the Media, has been working on this with UNESCO and others from the beginning, and this year we were happily awarded the first UNESCO chair on media freedom, journalist safety, and the fight against impunity, with a mandate to work with all stakeholders to raise awareness and to develop plans and projects in coordination, and particularly to put pressure on governments, work with governments to bring down the scourge of impunity and killings. Since we're here in Tokyo, might just be worth saying a word about the Committee to Protect Journalists Impunity Index, which they publish every year. And it shows yet again that 4 countries in Asia are now among those with the worst record, with more than 5 killings of journalists in the last several years, which have not been solved in the Philippines, India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. Also, you're also aware that the rate of killings of journalists in the Asia-Pacific area, which for many years was relatively low, is now quite close to the worst in the world. And that means the Latin America sphere and also the Middle East and Arab world. So it's going up largely because of attacks in South Asia, as I say, and the Philippines. You're aware of the crackdown on press freedom going on in Hong Kong, which has long been a beacon of press freedom and probably a test case for what is possible in Asia. And the denial of a renewed visa for Victor Mallet of the Financial Times there is one of many, many symptoms because he chaired a meeting at the Foreign Correspondents Club there with a speaker who was favouring independence for Hong Kong. There was a strongish statement from the British Foreign Secretary which acknowledged, first of all, it looks like a political act, that it disturbs the commitments made in the joint declaration between Britain and China, promising one country, two systems, freedom of speech and expression, and also a free legislature in Hong Kong. And in all those ways, now Chinese influence is interfering. The basic law, again, failing to protect. This is what the British government now says. There's a danger that the basic law is failing to protect freedom of expression there too. This is a familiar pattern. In many parts of the world, not only countries where there is a war, the system of law fails. It gets corrupted. Justice is no longer independent, and that means open season. Other fundamental rights then cannot be protected. It is a fundamental rule of international law. Take a look at the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and in particular the interpretation of that by the Human Rights Committee, a very important document published in 2011. It makes perfectly clear at the beginning that freedom of expression is a fundamental right that gives effect to many other covenant rights. So journalists should always bear that in mind. They're not just looking after their own interests. This is a public good. So this book, this is the most recent edition, 2014 edition of the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, Safety of Journalists Guidebook. It is a book intended essentially for the participating states, 57 of them, from Mongolia and Russia through to North America, through the whole of Europe, East and West. And this updated edition will go into more detail about the examples of misuse of law, misuse of power to control the information sphere, to jail and suppress the freedom of journalists in every way, every part of that region, and that will be out, I think, probably in the new year. What we're looking at in Europe too has to be called an epidemic now of violence, as well as misuse of law, criminal defamation, anti-terrorism laws, national security laws, which go way beyond what international law permits. Together, the journalistic community needs to find new answers. So, if you look at particularly the case of Jamal Khashoggi, I think, gives us an insight into the pattern which is now becoming more common. Indeed, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said this himself in an interview with the BBC about the implications of the Khashoggi killing. The murder of a champion of liberal ideas as a sign of a breakdown of the rules-based international order. He said, "I'm worried that this kind of incident is multiplying. It is absolutely necessary for the international community to say such things cannot happen." Mr. Khashoggi had, you've probably seen, written a column which was published by the Washington Post immediately after his death, which explained why the Saudi regime wanted to suppress him, but also it set out an answer to the prison of the mind, which Saudi Arabia and much of the Arab world has become. He expressed despair at what he called the brainwashing by propaganda of hate by his own government, which has succeeded in making an absolute control of the information sphere in the country. He spoke about an Arab version of the Iron Curtain, and his solution, his salvation, was, he said, through independent journalism. He wanted international platforms, international access for his people to the free world of debate and ideas that others share. So that has to be the target. When Mr. Guterres said this kind of incident is multiplying, I wonder what he meant. Perhaps he was talking about the incident earlier this year when two highly trained Russian agents, apparently working for military intelligence, were sent to the quiet town of Salisbury in England with weapons-grade nerve agents to kill a previous double agent, probably because he was informing the British government about nefarious activities of Russia-related mafias in Spain and other parts of Europe. Of course, there was one a bystander, a woman who was completely innocent, and she died. But of course, the whole country could have been affected because this is a very powerful poison. Or was he talking about the shocking murder in the Mediterranean, in the Malta, in the heart of the European Union, a member of the Commonwealth, of Daphne Caruana Galizia, best-known investigative journalist in her country, who was killed in a mafia-style bomb explosion by remote control. And yet, a year later, although some suspects have been rounded up, the investigation is no closer to knowing who in a powerful position, who would have had a motive to silence her, was responsible. And again, you look at the track record. Her house was set on fire. She called it an attempted murder because they stacked up tires behind to make sure that the fire went really strongly. There was nothing done after that. She asked for police protection because she'd had many threats. Nothing was done. She was suffering more than 40 defamation cases, which could have crippled her many times over because of the harsh defamation laws in her country, and she'd been declared effectively a public enemy by the entire political and business establishment for exposing the corruption and secrecy of exposed in the Panama Papers. And the lawyers for the family have said that the investigation is so far completely inadequate. So this is a case of impunity in the making. Or perhaps Mr. Guterres may even have had in mind some of the 1,000 or more tweets of the President of the United States calling the press enemies of the people, the worst people in the world, and so on. The outgoing head of the UN Commission on Human Rights, Zaid Rad al-Hussein, said, indeed, is it not an incitement for others to attack journalists, speaking of Mr. Trump's words. He also spoke about the consequences elsewhere. In other words, the United States now giving cover to those leaders in other countries who've declared open season on journalists. So the key message of the Day to End Impunity is take a look at the record, take a look at the most famous journalists we know who have been killed almost certainly by the arm of their own governments for exposing corruption, crime, and human rights abuses. You will see the names like Anna Politkovskaya in Russia. No mastermind has been brought to justice for her killing. Hrant Dink in Turkey. Lasantha Wickrematunge in Sri Lanka. He was the editor who wrote an editorial which was published posthumously predicting his murder at the hands of government agents. Or the Philippines, the Maguindanao massacre, more than 30 journalists killed at one time. Again, witnesses have been intimidated. It's not possible to bring justice there either. So, or Marie Colvin, in Homs in Syria, targeted by Syrian artillery, who tracked her through her use of her mobile phone and satellite phone. Nobody brought to justice. There, the International Criminal Court can perhaps be helpful. And of course, Jamal Khashoggi and Daphne Caruana Galizia. So, my argument to you is that as I think the evidence in the new version of this book will show, that this link between the attacks on journalists, the silencing of journalists, successful silencing of journalists through censorship and enforced self-censorship is part of a wider breakdown of the rules-based order built up since 1945. And if you consider what that's made of, how fragile it is, but what an extraordinary achievement it is, it all began with the UN Charter, and particularly the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, which is a miracle at the time, exactly 70 years ago on the 10th of December coming, thanks to Eleanor Roosevelt, where suddenly after the war, because of the horrors of the genocide, the Holocaust, the Second World War, all the mass destruction and killing, the countries of the world came together and set aside their national pride and sovereignty for long enough to agree on a universal declaration, not a national or international. This is a universal thing applying to every individual. And it has been strengthened by the International Covenant, which I mentioned, and by the regional human rights setups, intergovernmental setups with their own courts in Europe, of course, the European Convention and the court in Strasbourg, the Inter-American system with the court in Costa Rica, and the African system with a court in Arusha. And when you look in detail, you discover that each of those, although that none of them have enough resources, the European one is the best resourced and is the one with a universal right for individuals to take their case directly to the court, and that's not the same in the other courts. But they have all made strategic litigation. They've all made landmark rulings, particularly on the protection of journalists in two areas. One is to say, as the International Covenant and other treaties say, that states have an obligation when there is a threat, imminent threat against a journalist or anyone else dealing with public interest information, like a human rights defender, to put in place effective means of protection. That can mean police protection, 24-hour. Also, they have an equally strong positive obligation to conduct prompt, effective, impartial, independent investigations, and to remove from that investigation any person who may be, for example, the head of state or a minister, so any political appointments to the judiciary are absolutely out, and the family, the family and colleagues of the killed journalist must have proper access to the information, and their rights must also be defended. So in cases like Malta, you can guess in the cases like Jamal Khashoggi how difficult that is to achieve. Very briefly, I think my own experience after 35 years with the BBC, I was very fortunate to have that career, and 10 of them based in Japan, including the time of Tiananmen massacre in 1989, and then later when I was in Europe, flying to Washington to cover the 9/11 killings, spending time in Moscow, watching the rise of the Putin regime and its impact on spreading this poisonous, toxic concoction of disinformation, psychological warfare, military force, and subversion across much of Europe. So that was the background. But what I discovered, because I threw myself into this area of media freedom and safety and protection of journalists, is that governments are necessary. Governments are often the perpetrators or responsible. In fact, every case brought to the Strasbourg court is a case against a government. But without government action, without collaboration, without pressure on governments to implement their laws and commitments, we will never have the protection we need. So the Center for Freedom of the Media does advise governments, and we've been partly successful in helping UNESCO. We are one of many partners of UNESCO to implement the UN Action Plan, and also the Association of European Journalists, after about 7-8 years of very hard work with the Council of Europe, again 47 member states. What we achieved was to have all the member states agree to have effectively a monitoring system with now more than 12 media organizations and human rights organizations, including Association of European Journalists, the International Federation of Journalists, the European Federation, Reporters Without Borders, Committee to Protect Journalists, as trusted partners. So we have the ability to file alerts on every attack on the press or on journalism, and the Council of Europe sends that immediately to the member state for a response. So this is a way of engaging in a dialogue, putting direct pressure. It can happen. Just a word about what I mean by state capture. This is the mechanism by which so many countries, and this is outlined very much in the OSCE work, have private interests, powerful politicians and so on, succeed in gaining control of all the levers, significant levers of power in the country. So not just the executive, but the lawmaking, the judiciary, and in particular the power of the dominant media. And what we did not understand when the internet came along, it is not only exploded the possibility of self-expression and interconnection. Governments have been remarkably fast to seize these tools of control through surveillance, through tracking, through prosecution, through harsh laws, to lead the debate and to crack down on those who dissent. So in Russia, from the very beginning, the regime of Vladimir Putin simply took over the media sphere. It expelled Boris Berezovsky and other media magnates, as it did Khodorkovsky as well in Yukos, and seized control. Then came laws on extremism, which can be done without due process of law. So 2 strikes and you're out. So every media outlet lives in fear of being closed down arbitrarily. The control of the regulator, Roskomnadzor, is against all international practice. It has sweeping powers on the internet and for media, which it should not have. And of course, also violence, frequent violence. Several Russian journalists killed just in the last 18 months. One was apparently thrown out of his 5th floor balcony and impaled on railings after exposing Russian commercial military working in Syria. Hungary is another example. This is a peaceful and prosperous member of the European Union, and yet the government under Viktor Orban and his Fidesz party has done the same thing. It has imposed, it got a 2/3 majority in parliament, changed the constitution. It now has a significant say over the appointment of judges, the constitutional court. It has imposed a single source of news for all state-run media, the news agencies, the broadcasting and so on, so you lack diversity. So media freedom is made up of freedom from censorship, independence from all interference, and diversity. Those are also in international law. So they've gone, and also the use of state resources, denying advertising or allocating huge state budgets to advertise on media which are pro-government, squeezing out the others, resulted in the death of Nepsabrodsag, the most illustrious and oldest left-wing newspaper in Hungary, and now 17 out of 18 of the regional newspapers are said to be under control of friends of Mr. Orban, the Prime Minister. Turkey is an even more extreme case. After a long time when reforms were promised, and the government used formal and informal tactics to take over the main the main opposition newspaper, Hurriyet. That was just the early, with tax inspections and other intrusions, and laws were severe, including anti-terrorism laws. But then after the coup a couple of years ago, the constitution was changed in a way which really makes Turkey a monopoly of power in the hands of one man, again with lawmaking, justice and so on, very much under his control, and a few, hundreds of news organizations arbitrarily closed down, more than 100 journalists jailed, so Turkey is the biggest jailer of journalists in the world. I do recommend to you another branch of the OSCE, the Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, ODIHR, because if you look at their election observer reports after all elections in that area, in that region, you will find an extremely good rundown on the media landscape, and in particular the government control, political control of the media and its influence on the election results. So I would like to end. I'd like to talk a little bit about Japan, but perhaps in questions. I would like to end with a 5-point action plan. William Horsley's action plan, CFOM's proposal for the defense of journalism. The first is for journalists and all concerned with press freedom to know their rights, and that means going back to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the work of the Human Rights Committee to interpret it with these extraordinarily broad protections. The broadest scope of protection goes to freedom of expression and press freedom for very good reasons. The UN resolutions, particularly the most recent one, you will find there firm political commitments by the entire international community against online harassment of journalists, arbitrary surveillance, arbitrary detention, the public officials vilifying or demonizing journalists, and all misuses of law, the banning of encryption, and particularly the use of violence, so the need for protection. Also, the Sustainable Development Goals. I don't know how many of you know, but the Sustainable Development Goals, for the first time, have introduced the idea of protection of fundamental rights, in particular access to justice and access to information. It is number 16, goal number 16.10. And there is an indicator attached to that which is of special interest. All countries are asked to monitor and report the number of cases of killings of journalists, torture of journalists, kidnapping and arbitrary detention of journalists. And this is something, again, our centre is working with NGOs in Europe and others to try and make this really work, because it is a tool. It is potentially a successful tool. Also, take a look at the words of the US judge in the Pentagon Papers case of 1971. This is the First Amendment made good. Government power to censor the press has been abolished so that the press would remain free to censure the government. The press must be protected so it can bear the secrets of the government and inform the people. The same with the Council of Europe. The Council of Europe has these extraordinary rulings in the last 50 years protecting journalists, the broadest scope of protection, the right to freedom of expression, including those things that shock, disturb, and disturb. And Africa too has landmark cases, as I was saying. That's number one is to know the facts. Number two is to look at the regional landmark rulings. Number three is to look at practical ways of defending. Look at the Magnitsky Act. The Magnitsky Act has been invoked after the Khashoggi killing as a potential way to secure sanctions of some kind against the killers. It's in force in America, a version of it in the UK. The EU is looking at it as well. We need practical things, and journalists themselves can do a great deal. Take a look at the record of the Bellingcat organization. This is a small, about a dozen people working out of Leicester, a town in England. They are data experts. They have played an enormous role in revealing the facts about the downing of the Malaysian Airlines plane over Ukraine. They ascertained it came from a Russian base in eastern Ukraine. And also the identity of the Russians who went to Salisbury. Number 4 is my idea is, why doesn't Japan have, or perhaps it does, a press freedom award, or a number of press freedom awards? It's something this club might think about, the Japan National Press Club might think about, others concerned might think about. It would connect Japan to the outside world and honor journalists who risk their lives. And finally, just read the account by Tim Berners-Lee, the founder of the World Wide Web, what to do about the chaos, the Wild West chaos, the banditry now on the internet. One of his plans is to develop an alternative ecosystem for the internet called Solid, where people's data would no longer be the commodity which is used by Google, Facebook, and the others to enrich themselves. It would remain the property of the individual. So there's my 5-point plan. Thank you very much.
Well, I wasn't counting, but I could get more than 5 out of that. Sorry. Okay. Thank you very much, William. We'll now open the floor to Q&A. We'll give preference to working press, but after that we can open up to anyone else. Questions only, please. No comments unless they're related to a question, and keep them short and one per person. Thank you. Yes.
Süddeutsche Zeitung, Christoph Neidhardt. The paper that unearthed the Panama Papers. You wanted to talk about Japan, so I actually just wanted to pass you the ball to talk about Japan, but one word. In Japan, you have, and it's not about killing of journalists, but a suppression of press freedom. You have a collusion between the big publishers and the power. When Hatoyama was prime minister, they wanted to get rid of the Kisha clubs. And the publishers were against that. So the publishers want to suppress press freedom, the kind of press freedom they don't like. And actually that's related to the Panama Papers, because one big Japanese publisher suppressed news about their own involvement in the Panama Papers, or their own mentioning in the Panama Papers.
Yeah, thanks very much. Yeah, part of my message is supposed to be you be deceiving yourself if you live in Japan and you think you're immune from this, because these pressures for censorship and self-censorship are ubiquitous. They come in different forms. When the Japanese talk about jishuku or sontaku, we all know what they mean. Actually, this is a restriction on freedom of information, and this is what was identified clearly by David Kay, the Special Rapporteur of the UN for Freedom of Expression, who came here 2 years ago, wrote I think a very measured and constructive report for the UN Human Rights Council, which is worth reading in detail. He picked out in particular what he said were significant signals, worrying signals of threats to the independence of the media in Japan, thanks to direct and indirect pressure from officials. You think about the sackings of various people from Post in TV, the vague wording of the secrecy law. This is not something unique to Japan at all. It's something actually very similar to arguments being had in the UK and many other countries, Turkey particular, but they need to be faced. This lack of solidarity, the horizontal solidarity. I was struck by the fact I learned this week, I think it's true, that in Korea, a similar press club system has been modified or abolished, which shows that it is possible. And actually, one of my roles when I was here in the FCCJ in the 1980s, perhaps because I was working for the BBC, I was thrust into this role of representing the foreign press in Japan. So we became a bit of a hammer against the Kisha Club system, partly for access for international journalists, but also in order to prevent the Kisha Clubs becoming a cartel of collusion, where effectively awkward facts could go unexposed for a very long time. In fact, I did come to a conference in Japan, and a leading journalist from one of the leading dailies told me, oh, you don't need to worry in Japan because we are all a nation family, and dirty secrets sometimes remain secret for 20 years, but they come out in the end. This is the opposite to me of what independent journalism and forensic journalism is meant to be about. So I won't go into detail about Japan and the Panama Papers. I'm not sufficiently informed on the detail, but I would say this. It's good to see that the Japanese government has made public its very firm commitment on behalf of Japan in Asia to uphold international law, the international rules-based system, particularly by contrast, I think, with China. And one very good way to show that would be to show due respect to UN bodies when they come up with independent reports suggesting changes and reforms which are quite capable, the Japanese government is quite capable of doing. So I'm afraid that there is a large pool of undisclosed stories here. If you live for 2 weeks in England, you will see the expose of government mistakes going back, for example, the Windrush scandal, what happened in the 50s and 60s, Caribbean families and their rights being abused, historical sex crimes being exposed, and all government mistakes laid bare without mercy. In this country, I see very little, if any, of that, at least from the mainstream press.
Okay. Yes. Everyone knows you. Yes. Greg.
Good to see you back, Bill.
Hi, Greg.
I notice you make no mention of the Julian Assange problem. Is there some reason for that?
Well, I'm not sure whether you mean the problem that he's incarcerated in the Ecuador embassy, or that there's some talk that there may indeed be a way out, and the Ecuador government is very unhappy to have him there forever. I mean, the role of Julian Assange in exposing in the WikiLeaks was a seminal moment for the spread of information. It also was an enormous challenge for a lot of governments, and the reason why a lot of press freedom and journalist organizations were hesitant about it was because while they, including The Guardian and others who took a lead, were quite punctilious in making sure that this did not do unnecessary damage and that things were not revealed that would harm individuals and so on, that was not the way that it was handled by Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. So I think his star has fallen, and since then his organization is associated with the same kind of hacking and exposure without the editorial process, which most people regard as essential for responsible journalism.
Thank you. Yes, Peter Langen.
Langen, I'm now working freelance. Thanks for the talk. You mentioned the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and it being born, if you like, after the horrors of the Second World War. How much do you attribute the changes or the threat to the press right now and other democratic freedoms as a kind of loss of memory, if you like, that's sort of taking place, and how do you combat that? And secondly, following up on the question on Japan and press freedom, The Economist fairly recently put out a report stating that Japan and Taiwan were two examples of press-free countries, if you wish, in Asia. So do you have any comment on that? Thank you.
Yeah, I think, Peter, you make a very salient point. Obviously, the strategy which I mentioned earlier from Vladimir Putin's regime was quite explicitly one of creating a controlled information sphere where the record of the past was untouchable, so that any criticism of the Soviet war effort, anything that suggested Stalin crimes and so on, was an indictable offense. And of course, the extremism laws and so on made it, gave arbitrary powers to the government to, also with regard to Russia's actions in Crimea and Ukraine, for example. So this is an Orwellian attempt to control the mindset of people. And you remember that the International Covenant and other treaties say that although in times of threat to the state and war, governments can have the right to suspend certain aspects of freedom of expression, but freedom of opinion cannot ever be suppressed. It is inviolable. So that suppression, attempt to suppress alternative opinions or dissident opinions, is now becoming very common. And that the Russian example is the number one, although I think Mr. Erdogan's Turkey comes a close second, because there too all who criticize his government are lambasted as un-Islamic, anti-Islamic, anti-government, anti-state, and very often thrown into jail or dismissed from their jobs on that account. So their alleged membership of the you know the one I mean.
Exiled.
Yeah, the
religious leader now in the United States.
Yes.
Yes.
Alleged membership of what's called there a terrorist organization is enough to damn someone and remove them from the civil service and their job and so on. I think something similar is attempted elsewhere in countries like Hungary and indeed Poland, where the governments have assumed an innocence about their own actions, and they attempt to suppress. For example, the Polish government has got a position on the downing of the plane which killed a lot of Polish leaders in southern Russia, and they are very harsh on media that criticize that. So I think it is a very general attempt, and of course that is also something that was mentioned by the Special Rapporteur about Japan, that one of the weaknesses in Japan is that the debate on historical matters is not free in the way that it should be in a free society. So I think Japan's press freedom record has been rather charitably treated so far. If you consider what, for example, Malta was also in the top 20 until very recently, despite what we now know about the systematic intimidation by lawsuits, law firms in London sending threatening letters to all the mainstream media, as well as to Daphne Caruana herself. That kind of thing can suppress the critical climate of debate, which is essential. Taiwan has been chosen by Reporters Without Borders, I believe, as the base for its new base in Asia, in preference to Hong Kong, because it's regarded as relatively free. But the decline of Hong Kong is very, very worrying.
Let's see. Preference. You have to give preference to working press. Thank you.
Neidhardt, Süddeutsche. A very difficult question. I lived in the Soviet Union. I was posted in communist Poland. I worked in Ceausescu's Romania. I lived through the transition in Russia. I know China pretty well. When I look at these countries during those times and now, I think there is an improvement. These are pluralistic countries with big problems. So the problem of the freedom of the press is, some people would say it's not perfect, but it's gotten much better. What do you say about that? Thanks.
Yeah. Well, you're right. Actually, I do believe in a golden age of press freedom in Europe, and it was basically the first half or most of the 1990s. And that the reason for that is not that they were building up a free and pluralist press, but they were always getting closer to their target, and they had the goal of EU membership and NATO membership and Council of Europe membership as a goal. I think the big failure came with the Council of Europe approved the entry of Russia and others, as NATO did, but with the Council of Europe it was pretty fatal, because the Article 50, I think, of the Council of Europe is to uphold the Convention in national law. And the threat now, the very serious threat to the convention system in Europe, comes from the fact that so many of the national governments have reneged on that, that the convention cannot be upheld in domestic courts. So that's why you get this massive backlog in the Strasbourg court. And unfortunately, governments, including my own in Britain, have been too quick to blame the court for this, instead of the real blame lies, of course, with the national governments. I think we saw the victory of freedom of expression at the time of the fall of the wall and the end of all those communist regimes. And indeed in Russia, I recall I was presenting a program called Europe Direct in studios in London on tour around Europe, and Russian journalists were among those who were celebrating most. They were having a field day. Obviously, there was corruption and partisanship in the media in Russia, but there was a terrific sense of enjoying their freedoms and actually doing a public service. And then that clamped down very quickly after 2000 with the arrival of the Putin regime. And then I think that kind of harsh and determination to use the old systems of control of the party in places like Ukraine and Armenia and elsewhere was the first stage. Kazakhstan and so on, of course, never really got free. But elsewhere, there was, public service broadcasting helped rather than state broadcasting, and plurality as investment came in, particularly from the West, into countries like Poland and Hungary. And then that dried up. Why? Because there was resistance domestically, and also the interest from Bertelsmann and the other big investors in the West dried up because they were being discriminated against. So it was a combination of corporate power and government power that actually suppressed that wave of liberalization, I would say.
Yes, I'm sorry, I don't know you. Are you a working press person?
No, I'm not.
Okay, just one second.
It's my guess.
Well, thank you. That's very nice of you, yes. But is there anyone else who is working press? Okay, then go ahead. Thank you.
I understood that other people could speak after the working press.
Yes.
Richard Bronowski is my name, a former Australian diplomat. I'm very glad to be back in Japan, which was one of my stamping grounds many years ago. Donald Trump, you haven't mentioned the elephant in the room. This morning's New York Times had a litany of his lies in the mid-term elections. One thing they didn't really mention was the way he has scandalised the press and made them into such a bête noire of his own. To what extent do you believe this has resonance in other countries being encouraged to put just to stop the press at all?
I think
Actually, before you came, it was mentioned.
well, yeah, but it's a very good point. In fact,
You found it hard to get into the building.
yeah, to find a way. No, I mentioned also that the Commissioner for Human Rights of the UN had actually called Trump out on that and said that was this not an incitement to violence, and it was also giving cover to authoritarian governments elsewhere. But in particular, when you see in June of this year that the gunman who went into the Capitol Gazette building in Annapolis in Maryland and killed 5 people, with an automatic weapon, including 4 journalists, it was a sort of reminder of the Charlie Hebdo killings of 2015. That kind of open season on the press is encouraged, and indeed the U.S. press freedom press trackings is called. There's a U.S. press freedom tracker organization now with all the main press freedom organizations, and they've listed I think 50 assaults on journalists in the last year, which is a record. So there's a huge peak coming directly from that. But I think much more serious to me even than that is the ideology of Trump, where his Sean Spicer, his press spokesman, the very first press conference, came in and said, "I'm going to turn the tables. You're not going to watch on us. We're going to hold you to account." And only in the last week, Donald Trump has intensified that attack by suggesting that CNN and failing CNN it does not have the legitimate right to criticize him. He says they're so sensitive, they criticize me all the time, but when I criticize them, they complain, as though the media has no right to do it. This is why I come back to the basics of international law. This watchdog role is there from for example, the Goodwin case in the Strasbourg court from the 1990s is quite specific, that the protection of the confidential sources of journalists is a foundation of press freedom and therefore of democracy, because without it, the sources of information which the public need to know may suppress it and not give it to the press so that the public will know. This is very much the same language that I quoted from the judge in the Pentagon Papers case. That is the link of press freedom, and that is something that Trump is trying to usurp. And he, unfortunately, with some success. But I would point out that New York Times, not only has New York Times sales and profits gone up because they are now more read, but I do believe that the press around the world are learning new lessons in terms of fact-based journalism, accuracy, verification, attribution, the Bellingcat experience, and so on. This is the only and best way to call out governments that lie. But the one thing that is really necessary and is still lacking is leadership from other governments. We do need the democracies to stand up and stand together rather than do weapons deals with the Turkeys and the Saudi Arabias of this world while not mentioning the attacks on journalists.
Okay, yes, go ahead. Thank you. This is one last question. Thank you.
Thank you for your report. My name's Joan Anderson from Soka International. I just have a couple of quick questions about the role of ordinary citizens in all this, and maybe particularly young people. I'm just interested in how to increase kind of information literacy, or because people are awash with information, how to help us all sort of steer our way through this, and especially young people, whether there are things being done with students that you're involved with, and also whether you see any role for kind of citizen protectors of freedom of the press, given that if people see something happening to journalists, they can now, make that known themselves on through the internet and media. Hi.
Thanks. Yes, a very important point. By the way, I was talking, of course, about the Gulenists in Turkey. So sorry for that
Gulen.
short lapse. And indeed, millions of members of that particular sect or belief have suffered grievously by association with the coup without any evidence. Governments around the world and these UN documents now quite explicitly speak about the need to protect the civil society sphere. That's the freedom of speech in the society as a whole. There's also the core, for example, of the UK government's human rights policy. They talk about protecting the squeezed civil society sphere. So they were talking about things like the Open Society foundations, which have been persecuted in Hungary and in Russia. They've been thrown out a long time ago. Actually, I also cited the words of the Human Rights Committee in their. It's called General Comment 34 on freedom of expression. It's not a terribly exciting title, but it is a very, very important document. And there it makes absolutely clear that these protections, the binding protections in law, which states are obliged to provide, applies not only to full-time journalists, it applies to all those who are gathering and processing and publishing information of public interest, particularly about human rights and civil rights. So, governments we've gone from in the 21st century, we've gone from a situation of information scarcity to information overload. And this is tended, I think young people have actually been affected more than anyone else by this new universe that they're born into, the ocean of information and misinformation, which has caused a great deal of misery. Because bullying and so on, young people are extremely vulnerable, grooming and sexual violence, online harassment, all those things tend to apply very much to younger people and also to women. But I can assure you that in the international conversations that are going on, this link between the different stakeholders, so you have the national governments, the intergovernmental organizations, justice systems, NGOs, and civil society. Now there's an enormous effort being made to integrate the work of protection. For example, in this sphere of monitoring the Sustainable Development Goals. So my centre is working with Free Press Unlimited, a very large Dutch NGO, and one of the things they're doing is trying to map all the organizations around the world which are already doing this kind of monitoring, not just on the national level, but down into the provincial and local level. In places like the Philippines, you're talking about human rights defenders, environmental activists, all of whom are persecuted both by governments and by criminals and bandits. So it's a global scale which is required, but in law and in the protections of law, this should be universal. And one of the goals that my centre and many others have in mind is that these regional systems, which have served a great purpose in Europe, in the inter-American system, and in Africa, there is one enormous great hole, and that is for Asia-Pacific. So, UNESCO did hold a World Press Freedom Day in Jakarta. I think it was only a year ago. That was a significant opportunity. Also, this day, International Day to End Impunity for Crimes Against Journalists, was also held in Colombo, Sri Lanka, a couple of years ago. And that too, so promises were made. It's a start. Journalists tend to look down on this kind of thing. They say it's tokenism. Listen, if you don't involve, if you don't share the information, if you don't find ways to put pressure on government, it'll only get worse. Don't be cynical. Don't be sniffy about these things. Get stuck in. Say it like it is. Do a Bellingcat.
Good. Thank you very much. Do you have any further questions or anything? Do you have any further comments? Yes. Oh, well, I don't want to have anyone leave unsatisfied. So. Okay, good. Well, we'll take another question. Okay, thank you. Yes.
Sorry, I didn't identify myself. Clark, freelance. There's a particular problem, and it's not just in Japan, but elsewhere, where an individual writer like myself is defamed by a large organization, like, say, Sankei Shimbun. Okay.
It's just a what do you call it?
An example. Right.
Hypothetical.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
What do you do about it now? I think in some countries you have a press council where the individual can appeal against the large organization and get some sort of judgment. I noticed you haven't made much mention of that, but don't you think that's kind of one answer to this problem?
Yeah, I mean, actually, in the OSCE area, criminal defamation is still on the statute book in more than half the countries. The UK only got rid of it several years ago, and that was in England, not in the whole country. The defamation laws, but also the operation of courts, the awards of costs and damages, and so on, is very liable to be weighted for the rich and powerful corporations and against the individual. And this is an inherent unfairness, which it's quite difficult to get at because the legal system tends to support it because they get fat fees from those with deep pockets. And it is obviously one of the tests of a society with protections for the individual that they come up with an equitable system. So I think it is a fairly common problem. I think in the area in Europe, which I'm used to, you look at countries like Bulgaria, Romania, and so on, where it's pretty much a free-for-all, and the oligarchs and many criminals are now in charge of the media, and they are using it systematically to defame and vilify their opponents and drive them out. And where there is no government playing a neutral role, where particularly you have a media regulator which is capable of stepping in, then that gets completely out of control. Actually, it's worth mentioning in the UK after the phone hacking and other wrongdoing of the press were exposed, there has been an attempt at getting some non-judicial preliminary system going so that individuals who are mistreated or misquoted in the press have an easier access to get the issue corrected. So there's a correction, an apology, and so on, without having to go through the courts, which is beyond the means of many. I'm afraid that is struggling, but there is at least now this IPSO, Independent Press organization, which is striving in that direction. So it's a bit better than it was, but it's interesting to observe that the British Parliament, members of Parliament, almost to a man, were in favour of a much more heavy-handed approach against the press, which would have involved a sort of state formulated system of enforced membership of a set of rules which would be much more heavy-handed. That was resisted, I think, quite correctly by the media, but they've not yet put their own house in order. I'm talking about the UK, but I think it is mirrored elsewhere, so I take your point.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we've run a little bit past time. It's always, it's a real surprise to know that someone that you have always thought of as a colleague and a dinner partner happens to have an encyclopedic knowledge of some subject that is of such importance to all of us who write and broadcast for a living. I'd like to thank William for taking care of all of us, and I would like to strongly encourage all of you who have any issues, any information, to get in touch with him through his organization. And thank you very much, William. And here's an absolutely redundant honorary membership, since you're already an old hack.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Thank you very much. I can imagine there's a lot of 3 to my notes in that, or more. Thank you, thank you.